6% commission is dead. All right, let's see it. I'm Adam Hamalian,
And I'm Sherry Hutchens.
and this is the Real Story with Adam and Sherry, where we talk about all things real estate, primarily for our clients, but also for our colleagues, and we hope to have a little fun along the way. So, Sherry, let's talk about it. What was the big announcement that came out from the National Association of Realtors on Friday?
Yeah, on Friday we had the big news that NAR, National Association of Realtors, has come up with a proposed settlement in the big Missouri lawsuit that happened last year.
And I think on its face, it was intended to help buyers and sellers. And I think in a number of ways it does. It protects them by providing some transparency. Um, but there's been a lot of miscommunication about it. What's some of the incomplete or faulty information that you've heard about the settlement?
Well, as you said at the beginning of the podcast, I mean, the email was just barely sitting in our inboxes before CNN was blasting out a headline that said 6% commission is dead. So I think that was the big one.
I think when I heard that, it sounded like the whole 6% was going away and that people were going to get to buy and sell houses for free. And it's like that, it's like, agents aren't going to work for free.
No,
And
that's
while there are people out there who don't want to work with agents, a recent poll said that 90% of people were appreciative and saw the value both in their buyer's agent and their listing agent. We spent a lot of time working on honing our craft, and I do think we're offering something of value. So that was one of the myths, was that it's just going to go away. What was some of the other things you heard?
I heard that buyers and sellers are going to make more money, or sellers are going to make more money and buyers are going to pay less fees. Not sure how that one came about.
Yeah, that both can't be true, right? They both can't deduct the same amount. So,
What
all
did
right.
you hear?
Well, what I heard was that part of the reason why this was in place because list buyers agents were only showing properties where there was a larger commission shared, and I just thought that was ridiculous. Maybe that happens in other parts of the country. There's two reasons why it doesn't happen here. One, it's against our code of ethics that I want my client we want our clients to find the best house possible, and I literally never look at what the compensating commission is for the buyer's agent.
What?
So I don't even know. That's the first thing. And second, if you were to go look, the 95% of them are offering the same amount. And in our area, that's been 2.5% since the downturn in 2008.
Even here,
Very,
since I got into the business in 2001, it's been like that.
yeah. So, and I think the other thing about the 6% is that the commission's always been negotiable, and it feels like there's this sentiment being put out there that somehow buyers and sellers didn't have an opportunity to go interview multiple agents. I think it's one of the few careers that is on up for negotiation with every contract, that at any given day somebody could go interview 3 or 4 agents and pick which one they like working with for whatever commission is being charged by that agent. So there's always been choice in our industry.
Yeah.
But I don't really want to focus on agents so much. I want to focus on the experience for buyers and sellers. Because let's just face it, people don't really care about how we make our money. They care about how it affects them. And so let's focus on that for a little while. What are some of the things that came out of the lawsuit other than the cash settlement to go to the plaintiffs in this class action lawsuit? What are some of the other terms that have come out?
Can we talk about what the basis of the lawsuit was
Sure,
before
of
we
course. Yeah.
actually know today, and what is still up in the air and hasn't been decided? So, a group of sellers in Missouri filed a lawsuit that said that National Association of Realtors had colluded to overcharge them with commission, and that they didn't know they had a choice on how much commission was paid. They were just told it was 6%. And some of them even claimed that they didn't know that some of that money was going to pay the buyer's agents. And they were thinking, why should we pay buyer's agents? They're not working for us. So that was kind of the basis of the lawsuit. And after lots of back and forth and some pretty serious financial numbers that were tossed around initially, like over $2 billion in damages, now we have some resolution. And it's important to note that This is all proposed. It still has to be approved by the courts and eventually by the Department of Justice. But there's two things that we know. The rest of it we don't know. One of them is that all buyers and agents will have to sign what's called a buyer broker agreement that creates a contract between the two parties that specifies that they have a agency relationship and that there will be a commission paid by someone. And the second thing is,
The second thing is that we on the multiple listing service, which is how realtors communicate with each other about listings, and then those get pushed out to places like Zillow and Redfin, that we're no longer able to put what the um, compensation is offered to the buyer's broker. So that means we can't see what's being offered when we're looking at a particular house. And again, this is the purpose of this was so that it would prevent agents from only showing houses where there was a higher commission. And like I said, for those of us that were already working in the with our ethics and our fiduciary responsibilities, it was that we weren't looking at it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Um, but it's going to be complicated for buyers because on any particular house, they're not sure what their expense is going to be until they get ready to write that offer. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. Um,
does those two things don't go into effect until middle of July. We don't actually have an actual date, but they're saying middle July. And the reason for that is there's all kinds of other issues that have got to be worked out until then, uh, until that happens, including final approval by the courts, final approval by the Department of Justice. There's a good indication that the courts are going to approve it. And the penalties are down from 2 billion something to 400 million something, which still seems like a lot of money to me.
it does. So it was a local judgment in Missouri where it started, but it has national implications because one of the defendants was the National Association of Realtors. But all real estate is local, and here in California, we have had better practices than many states, and so in our area, the listing agreement has always had this is what the full commission that is negotiated between seller and the broker, and then it explicitly said how much of that was going to be shared with the buyer's um, broker. It's interesting because part of the complaint in this lawsuit was the sellers were saying, "Why do I have to give money to the buyer's broker who's essentially working against us?" And it's a completely legitimate concern that there is this conflict of interest. I I think that one of the things that we're going to talk about here in a moment, though, is there a marketing strategy for still doing that? And it'll vary, I think, depending upon price point and market. But I think it's one of the positive things that have come out of this lawsuit is that sellers are a little bit more in control about where their money is going, though it's not a blanket decision about what's going to happen. So let's get into that a little bit. Let's start with buyers. What does this change mean to buyers if the compensation is no longer A, guaranteed to come from the listing agent, and B, if they don't know what it is until they write on a offer? So I think we need to start with the buyer broker agreement that you mentioned. What does the buyer broker agreement solidify for both the agent and the buyer?
It solidifies that there is going to be a working relationship between the agent and the buyers, and it is a contract. And then it also specifies um, what the commission is for the buyer's agent to represent that buyer.
And then it doesn't necessarily specify who's paying for it. So for instance, if the agreement is say 2.5% and the listing agent and the seller have agreed to compensate the buyer's agent 2.5%, then the buyer doesn't have to pay anything additional. They just are buying the house. But it then gets confusing that if the seller and the listing agent have agreed on say 2%, then the buyer would need to come up with 0.5% to pay their agent the difference. But in the other direction, if the seller and the listing agent have agreed on 3%, then half of that percent is a discount. It doesn't go to the buyer's broker because they have already agreed that 2.5% is going to be their compensation.
Buyer.
Yeah, so it goes the buyer less money that the
Buyer
buyer has to
agreeing
bring.
at 2.5% and the seller is offering 3%, that overage goes to the buyer is what we're hearing. I don't know how that's gonna happen. I think that there are
Just less cash that they have to bring to closing, I think.
yeah, but there are limits in the lending world about how much of a credit that a buyer can get. And so what if they've maxed out their credit and all of a sudden they're getting another 0.5%?
Yeah.
That,
Well,
that,
and
all
this
kinds
is
of
the
things that
closest scenario. Yeah, this is the closest scenario to the way it is right now. And it's built into the cost of the buyer's agent is built into the purchase price to which the lender then is lending on. But when it turns out that that's not done that way, say the seller and the listing agent don't agree to pay anything, and the buyer has to pay their agent out of pocket, talk about what that might look like for the buyer.
yeah, I think it varies by buyer. If it's a first-time buyer who is scraping together every penny to make their down payment and cover their closing costs, and then all of a sudden they're being expected to pay their broker as well, where does that money come from? Does it get financed into their loan? We don't know if that is even going to be possible. Federal government has to weigh in on that because they're the ones who dictate those kinds of rules. Are they going to look for a less expensive house than they originally would have been able to afford so they can cover their agent's commission? Are they going to say, forget it, I don't need an agent, I'm going to work with the listing agent? And then that creates another problem because they don't really have any representation if they're working with the listing agent because the listing agent is representing the seller. So it creates all kinds of problems. Uh,
The the other complicating thing around vendor or lender requirements is that if it's a VA loan, the VA, which looks out for our vets, thankfully, doesn't allow the VA borrower to pay their buyer's agent because the rules have been such that that hasn't. It's been to protect them from getting double charged or overcharged. Well, now it may be that that if the seller isn't going to pay for that, the VA buyer is kind of stuck.
yeah,
So it's particularly for those. I mean, we don't have a lot of VA buyers in our area because we don't have a lot of military. I mean, but if we were up in Vallejo near Travis, or Fairfield near Travis Air Force Base, where we had active service, or in a place where veterans were migrating to, where they still qualify for that, it would be a big deal. And we're hoping that the federal government and the administration that governs this stuff takes a good look at how can we protect all buyers, but in particularly the way it's going to affect VA loans.
It's
Uh, uh,
interesting 'cause everybody's making this about the commission, but it's really about representation for each buyer and seller, especially in a state like California and in our local area where it is a very litigious climate. And the person who trained me to be a realtor always said to me, we are held to a higher standard here because we have more sophisticated buyers than we have anywhere else, and they have the money to go out and hire an attorney if they need to. So they both buyer and seller need representation so that they are making fully informed decisions about the homes that they are buying. And when you complicate it with having them having to figure out having to figure out how the agents are being compensated, it just doesn't quite seem fair to either of those parties when the reason for this whole lawsuit was that they felt that they weren't being treated fairly.
right. And it used to be that a buyer could go hire whatever agent they wanted that they thought best served them and didn't have to think about how they were being compensated. And so, in an effort to protect the seller from overpaying commission, the buyer now has to take on that responsibility of weighing basically three choices. Either try and convince this listing agent to do dual agency, which has its own perils, or then deciding, do I pay for the agent that I want who might be charging more, or settle for an agent that charges less but maybe offers less service or has less knowledge about a certain area or a type of transaction? So it's gonna give the buyer choices, and that generally choices are good, but in an already stressful situation, it's that one more choice, it might be complicated for some. But we're going to have to figure out how to navigate that with our clients.
Yeah, I think moving forward, that the best thing you and I can do is just business as usual, because we don't know how this is going to play out. We've got till the middle of July before we have things etched in stone, and then we will pivot and change to however we have to work in order to follow the rules. But in the meantime, we're going to do what we've always done, and that is um, do buyer interviews and, hear what they have to say, tell them how we work, and come to an agreement about how we're going to help them reach their goals. And I assume that other agents are going to have to start doing buyer interviews as well. I know that we're one of the few in our office that actually does a buyer interview, and we find it invaluable.
Let's transition to how this is going to affect sellers. So immediately they believe that they're going to save on their commission, and they probably will. They'll be aggregately they'll be paying less. But let's talk about what choices are sellers going to be faced with regarding offering any or no buyer agent compensation. What are your first thoughts about that?
I think that an astute agent will understand the value of having an experienced buyer's agent on the other end of the transaction, because you don't want to work with an inexperienced agent, or worse, no agent at all. Um, and whether or not they're going to pay them the 2.5 or the 3% that has been customary up to now, who knows? I mean, it's going to be completely up to them, as it's always been. It's always been that way, but even more so now. So I
What
don't
are
know
what are
about
some
it.
circumstances where a seller might be wise to still pay for the buyer's agent commission besides just having a adequate representation on the other side? Are there any circumstances where it benefits them to have to pay for the buyer's agent's commission?
Well, I think right off the bat, in an entry level home, probably having a seller pay for the buyer's agent's commission, so that the first time or entry level buyer can afford to actually buy the home without having to worry about how they're going to pay their agent. I mean, what
I
do you
think
think?
that I think that that's I think there's a misperception that there's a dollar for dollar savings on not paying the buyer agent commission. But it really is an 80-20 uh, possibility of how it'll affect the buyer's buying capacity. Because if it takes up their cash, say they want to buy a house at 500,000 and they have 100,000 to use as a down payment and pay for all the costs that they have, so they're going to put 20% down. Well, if they have to pay their agent, let's just say $10,000, that's 2% basically. That means that they are reducing their down payment towards the purchase to 90,000, and now their purchase power is 450. So instead of being able to buy a house at 500, they're only going to be able to offer 450. But if the seller agrees to pay the buyer's commission, just say that 2%, now all of a sudden they go back up to 490, as they're netting 490 from the transaction rather than 450. So the seller is getting, they're getting from buyers who have the buyers will have more capacity by paying at that end. At higher ends, it's going to be different. I think most of the $2 million buyer cash flow is not as big of a deal. It's not affecting their purchasing power. But anybody that's going to tell you that it's going to be neutral on home sales doesn't know. I don't think any of us know how it's going to affect it. It may be that there are still plenty of buyers who can pay the full price and pay their agent, but it's what we were talking about at the beginning. Not both the buyer and the seller can claim it, and it's not going to be a dollar for dollar savings, particularly at price points where either it's first time home buyers or the move up buyer who's struggling to move out of the condo into a single family home because their family is growing. There's a lot more for us to see here. There's a lot more for us to learn.
Yeah, and for those of you who might be listening to this podcast from outside of the Bay Area, There are no $500,000 houses in our market. Our least expensive market in our surrounding area where we work is probably Martinez, and that's probably an average sales price right now about 750, or a starting sales price about 750,
That's
somewhere
right.
around there. No $500,000 homes. And
Yeah.
the other thing we tell our clients all the time, to add on to what you just said, is we know for a fact that a seller makes more money when there's more than one offer. And
Yep.
the best way to get more than one offer is to offer compensation to a buyer's agent so everybody can jump in the pool and not have to worry about how their buyer's agent is going to be paid. I think that's going to be a strong inducement for sellers to pay that commission if they understand how that works. Because if you have one offer, you've got one offer to play with. If you've got two or more, you've got counter offers and multiple counter offers and all kinds of ways that you can make more money for your seller, if you can compare offers and I don't want to say them against each other, but that's essentially what you're doing, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's determining market value. I mean, they both in that multiple offer situation, each buyer is in control of their own choice about what they're going to offer for that property. And that's how you determine highest and best is who's willing to pay for that.
yeah,
Uh,
that's the saying, buyer determines value. It is so true,
and the,
especially.
the, the last thing I want to say, well, maybe not the last thing, but the buyer is the only one bringing funds and exposure to the purchase, right? They're the ones that are going to have to live with the house after the transaction's sold. They're the one that's going to have to live with the debt. And one of the things that is kind of confusing about the way the lawsuit settlement is right now is the the buyer deserves to know ahead of time who's paying what commission to whom, because they're the one ultimately, the seller gets their money from the buyer, the listing agent gets their money from the buyer, the title and escrow company, the insurance company, the lender, and of course the buyer's agent themselves ultimately get it from the money that the buyer brings to the transaction. And right now, the way the settlement reads, by removing that compensation from the MLS, it's removing transparency. And I understand why they're doing it, because they think that somehow agents aren't going to show all the properties. Like I said, we have always done that in our area. That's not even really up for discussion. But the buyer's the one that's going to have to figure out how to navigate this, even though it's supposed to be in their benefit as a consumer. Um, I think there's lots more for us to learn as this gets unpacked. Hopefully, as the court reviews it, they'll see some of the challenges here and maybe amend them. Um, Ultimately, I think that there's some really good things that will happen for both buyers and sellers, but there also is some very confusing things in the meantime, and we're going to wait to sort those things out.
So what's your best advice to people who are watching this in the media, and um, what, how should they get the real information, the truth?
So I would be very careful listening to the national news, not because I think they're wrong, but because it's incomplete and all real estate is local. And they might be talking about how laws are used in other parts of the country. And in California, we have our own essentially ecosystem that I think is generally more favorable to the consumers than lots of places because of our being a litigious state. Our association realtors, lawyers have done a good job of trying to make contracts that are fair to all parties involved. I recently was involved in a transaction in Georgia, and I got one disclosure, and that was a lead-based paint disclosure, and it wasn't even specific. It just said if the house was built before 1976, 77, whatever that date is, and it might have lead paint. Well, of course, we're pretty sure it does. But I didn't, there was
I
no other disclosures available. It was buyer beware, got to do your own work. Here in California, we're almost at the other end of the extreme where we have like 15 or 20 standard disclosures that are just that aren't property specific. And so when you
Wait, are
hear
you
that
telling me
national
the
news,
seller didn't have to do their own disclosures? They didn't
no,
have.
seller didn't have to do anything. Yeah. And the other thing that was interesting was that there was a lawyer who operated as the escrow officer. I wrote my initial deposit check to the lawyer's office, and they had a trust account for it. Of course, they're a trustworthy, neutral third party, and they helped us navigate that. So you may not pay. And I had an agent who helped with that transaction who got paid for it. So
Was he
people
a
are going
listing
to get paid
agent
for
or a
it.
buyer's agent?
He, in this case, it was kind of an off market. He double ended it, but only because we were doing private negotiations with the seller. But he helped us with the transaction, and so we compensated him for his time and energy. I would
Awesome.
never buy a property without an agent, and I would never recommend, even though I'm a professional myself, and I would never recommend a family member do it without an agent. There's just too much at stake to go into it without somebody representing you.
Yeah.
All right, I think that that's probably about as much as we can do now until we have more information. Last thoughts, Sherry, before we sign off.
Last thoughts are before you believe what the people on TV are telling you about this situation, call us and we'll tell you the real story.
That's right. The real story with Adam and Sherry. Come right back here. All right. Thanks everybody for spending this time with us. We hope this was helpful and informative, eases some of your anxiety. We as real estate agents are living with a little bit of the unknown, but we're thankful for all of you joining us on this journey as we walk with you. Bye,
See you
everybody.
next time.